Welcome to Famous Tale.
Mwizi City, the heart of tradition and chaos. The sun rose over Mwizi City, painting the skyline in hues of orange and gold. The streets buzzed with life, merchants setting up colorful stalls, the smell of spiced tea and frying mandazi filling the air. The city pulsed with the clash of tradition and change. Kofi, a dutiful 25-year-old son, walked through the busy streets, weighed down by something heavier than his satchel. Until recently, he had been the pride of his family, until Zuri came into his life. Zuri, the alluring flame. Kofi spotted Zuri at a cafe, her laughter loud, her red dress a bold contrast to the modest attire of the women around her. She was everything Kofi wasn't, reckless where he was careful, bold where he was cautious. Yet, he couldn't help but be captivated. "Kofi," she called, her smile both warm and knowing. He approached, his heart racing. Later, Kofi returned home to a simple house where the scent of ugali filled the air. His parents, Baba Mwangi and Mama Adissa, greeted him with concern. "Not again, Kofi," Baba Mwangi said, his gaze hardening at the mention of Zuri's name. "She doesn't respect our ways," Mama Adissa added softly. Frustrated, Kofi replied, "She cares about me. Isn't that enough?" The argument dragged on late into the night, with Kofi storming out, unwilling to let his parents control his heart. Zuri's influence grows. As days passed, Kofi spent more time with Zuri, who filled his world with excitement, though also isolated him from his family. "Your parents are stuck in the past," she said one evening. "We're the future." Kofi, though conflicted, felt pulled deeper into her orbit. One evening, as they walked near the jungle's edge, Kofi recalled childhood stories of lost souls haunting the trees. Zuri laughed it off, but something about the dark, looming jungle unsettled him. Foreshadowing the storm. The chapter closes with tensions rising, Kofi torn between his family's values and Zuri's defiance. And in the distance, the jungle stands silent, waiting for the choices that will soon unravel his life. Shifting shadows. The days in Mwizi City grew heavier for Kofi, not from the sun, but from the weight in his chest. Conversations with his parents became strained, while Zuri's presence, once intoxicating, now felt like both a thrill and a trap. One evening, as they strolled along the waterfront, Zuri asked, "Do you want this forever? Sneaking around, listening to your parents lecture you about me? Is that what you want?" Kofi hesitated. "No. I want us to be happy. Together. Then prove it." Her words hit him like a thunderclap, the fractured bond. The next day, Kofi tried to act normal, helping his mother in the garden and his father with a broken chair. But his parents' soft hopes for his future only deepened his guilt. That night, Zuri's words echoed in his mind, "Prove it." Zuri's game. A week later, Zuri invited Kofi to her apartment, where she pushed him further, telling him his parents were holding him back. "They'll never accept me. You'll always be stuck unless you choose us." Kofi struggled with the thought, torn between his parents and Zuri. The turning point. Zuri's proposition became clear. He had to choose, his family or her. The pressure mounted as she planted the idea of taking his parents far away, to a place they couldn't interfere. The jungle's call. That night, Kofi wandered to the jungle's edge, the myths of cursed souls swirling in his mind. Could he really leave his parents behind? A choice is made. Kofi finally made the choice. "I'll do it," he whispered to Zuri. The plan. Zuri helped Kofi plan the trip, convincing him to tell his parents they were going to the jungle for a picnic. The final evening. The night before the trip, Kofi sat at dinner with his parents, forcing a smile as his heart broke. Tomorrow, everything would change. A day of shadows. The morning dawned with an eerie stillness. The usual sounds of Mwizi City, the street vendors shouting their wares, the distant hum of motorbikes, felt muffled, as if the world itself held its breath. Kofi sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. They trembled slightly, as if they already knew the blood they would soon carry. Mama Adissa called from the kitchen. "Kofi, come eat. You need energy for this trip you've planned." Her voice, warm and cheerful, twisted the knife of guilt deeper into his chest. But he forced himself to stand, plastering a smile on his face as he joined his parents at the table. "This is such a lovely idea," Mama Adissa said, her eyes lighting up as she spooned tea leaves into the pot. "We haven't been out of the city in so long." Baba Mwangi nodded. "Yes, and a family outing will do us all good. It'll be nice to spend time together." Kofi felt his throat tighten. He looked away, unable to meet their eyes. The drive to the jungle was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the old car's engine. The road wound through the outskirts of Mwizi City, the vibrant chaos of the markets giving way to rolling fields and clusters of small villages. Mama Adissa hummed softly, a song Kofi remembered from his childhood. It was a lullaby she used to sing when he couldn't sleep, and hearing it now made his chest ache. Zuri's instructions echoed in his mind: stick to the plan. Don't hesitate. As the jungle loomed closer, the once distant line of trees grew into a towering wall of green and shadow. The air changed, growing heavier, thicker, as if the jungle itself was alive and watching. When they arrived, Kofi parked the car on a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the dense foliage. His parents stepped out, stretching and smiling as they took in the beauty of their surroundings. "This place is magnificent," Baba Mwangi said, his voice filled with awe. Kofi forced a nod. "Yeah, it is." The picnic. They spread a blanket on a small clearing near the edge of the jungle. Mama Adissa unpacked the food, freshly baked bread, roasted chicken, and fruit, and they ate together under the dappled light filtering through the trees. For a moment, Kofi allowed himself to forget. He laughed at Baba Mwangi's stories and savored the taste of the food. He even joined in as his mother teased him about his childhood antics. But the jungle didn't forget. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, sending a cascade of leaves to the ground. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. "It's getting late," Kofi said, his voice tight. "Maybe we should go for a walk before we head back." Mama Adissa smiled. "That sounds lovely. Lead the way." Into the jungle. Kofi led his parents deeper into the jungle, following a narrow trail that wound between the trees. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the canopy above growing so dense that it blocked out the sun. "This place feels different," Baba Mwangi remarked, glancing around. Mama Adissa nodded. "It's beautiful, but there's something about it. Like it's alive." Kofi's hands clenched into fists. "It's not too late," a voice in his head whispered. "You can turn back." But then he thought of Zuri, her smile, her promises. "Prove it," she had said. "Kofi?" Mama Adissa's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he lied. "Let's keep going." The moment of betrayal. They reached a small clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky. The air was unnaturally still, the only sound the distant call of a bird. "This is a good spot to rest," Kofi said, his voice hollow. As his parents sat on a fallen log, Kofi stepped back, his heart pounding. He reached into his bag, pulling out the knife Zuri had given him. The blade glinted in the faint light, cold and sharp. "What's that for?" Baba Mwangi asked, frowning. Kofi froze, his breath catching. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Kofi?" Mama Adissa stood, her eyes filled with concern. "What's wrong?" "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Before they could react, he lunged. The aftermath. The jungle was silent once more, save for Kofi's ragged breathing. His hands were stained red, the knife lying at his feet. His parents' lifeless bodies lay on the ground, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and betrayal. Kofi fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of what he had done crashed over him, suffocating him. "I'm sorry," he cried, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The jungle seemed to watch, its ancient trees standing as silent witnesses to his crime. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out, its mournful call echoing through the air. Kofi dug shallow graves, his hands trembling as he covered his parents' bodies with earth. Each handful of dirt felt like a betrayal, a final act of disrespect to the people who had loved him unconditionally. When he was finished, he sat by the graves, his head in his hands. The jungle felt alive now, its shadows shifting, its whispers growing louder. Return to Zuri. As Kofi stumbled back into the city that night, his clothes stained with dirt and blood, Zuri was waiting for him. She greeted him with open arms, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "Now we can finally be free." Kofi nodded numbly, unable to speak. Zuri led him inside, handing him a glass of wine and guiding him to the couch. "This is the beginning of our new life, Kofi. You'll see. Everything will be perfect." But as she smiled at him, Kofi felt nothing. No relief, no joy, only an emptiness that threatened to consume him. The jungle's whispers. In the dead of night, as Kofi lay awake in Zuri's bed, the whispers of the jungle filled his mind. He saw his parents' faces, heard their voices. "Kofi," they called. "Why?" He pressed his hands over his ears, but the whispers didn't stop. The jungle had marked him, and it would not let him forget. Zuri's new world. In the weeks that followed the murder, Kofi's world fell apart while Zuri's seemed to blossom. She moved with a renewed confidence, her laughter brighter and her tone sharper. She started speaking of plans to build a life, though every decision seemed to revolve around her. "We should redecorate," she said one morning as they stood in Kofi's family home, the place that now belonged to him, and, by extension, to her. "This furniture is so old-fashioned. We need something modern, something vibrant." Kofi nodded absently, staring at the table where he had once shared countless meals with his parents. The house felt cold, as if their absence had drained it of warmth. Zuri's fingers brushed his arm, snapping him back to reality. "What do you think?" "Sure," he muttered, though he hadn't heard a word she'd said. Her smile tightened, but she let it slide. "Good. I'll handle everything. You just relax." The legal trap. It wasn't long before Zuri began suggesting more significant changes. "We need to put the house in my name," she said casually one afternoon, sipping tea on the veranda. "It'll make things simpler for when we start building our future together." Kofi frowned. "Why would we need to do that? It's already ours." Zuri rolled her eyes, her tone slipping into irritation. "It's not about need, Kofi. It's about trust. If we're building a life together, there shouldn't be any of mine or yours. It's just yours. Don't you trust me?" The question cut deep, her words laced with the kind of manipulation that Kofi couldn't see clearly through his haze of guilt and self-loathing. He wanted to argue, but the memory of her encouragement, the way she had promised him happiness, silenced him. A week later, he signed the papers. A shift in Zuri. The moment Zuri gained control, her demeanor shifted. She stopped pretending to care about Kofi's feelings, her sharp remarks becoming daily occurrences. "Why do you always look so miserable?" she snapped one morning. "You're like a ghost, Kofi. It's exhausting." He stared at her, hollow-eyed, but said nothing. "You're useless," she continued, throwing her hands in the air. "I thought you'd be stronger than this. You wanted this life, remember? You made the choice." Her words felt like daggers, but Kofi didn't fight back. He had no strength left, no will to defend himself. Discovering the betrayal. One evening, Kofi returned home to find Zuri speaking to a stranger in hushed tones. The man wore a crisp suit and carried a folder filled with papers. As Kofi stepped into the room, they both stopped talking abruptly. "Who's this?" Kofi asked, his voice weak but curious. "Just someone helping me with some business," Zuri said, brushing him off. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Kofi couldn't ignore the unease creeping through him. Later that night, as Zuri slept, he searched through the papers the man had left behind. His heart sank as he read the documents, deeds, contracts, and plans to sell the house and land. Zuri wasn't building a future with him. She was dismantling everything his family had built. The confrontation. The next morning, Kofi confronted her. "You're selling the house?" he asked, holding the papers in his trembling hands. Zuri didn't even bother denying it. "So what if I am? It's mine now. You signed it over, remember?" "But this is my family's home," he said, his voice breaking. "Your family is dead, Kofi," she said coldly. "And you made sure of that. Don't act like you care about this place now." Her words hit him like a slap. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, the weight of her betrayal crashing over him. "You used me," he whispered. Zuri rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. You wanted me, and I gave you what you wanted. Now I'm doing what's best for me. That's how life works." Thrown out. That evening, Zuri packed his belongings into a bag and tossed it onto the front steps. "Get out," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Kofi stood in the doorway, his heart shattered. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem," she said with a shrug. "You wanted to be free, remember? Well, here's your freedom." With that, she slammed the door, leaving Kofi alone on the street. Wandering the city. For days, Kofi wandered aimlessly through Mwizi City. The vibrant streets that once felt alive now seemed foreign and unwelcoming. He avoided familiar places, unable to face the memories they held. At night, he slept in alleyways or under the awnings of closed shops. The city's hum, once comforting, now felt like a reminder of his failures. But it wasn't just the city that haunted him. The jungle called to him, its whispers growing louder with each passing day. The pull of the jungle. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kofi found himself standing at the edge of the jungle. The trees loomed before him, their shadows long and foreboding. He thought of his parents, of the love they had given him and the terrible way he had repaid them. He thought of Zuri, of the promises she had made and the way she had torn his life apart. The jungle seemed to beckon him, its whispers filling his mind. "Come back. Face what you've done." Kofi took a step forward, then another. The shadows swallowed him whole. The jungle's judgment. As Kofi ventured deeper into the jungle, the air grew heavier, the sounds of the city fading behind him. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches like grasping hands. He reached the clearing where he had buried his parents, the ground still marked by the hastily dug graves. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The jungle offered no comfort, its silence a stark reminder of his sins. The final decision. Kofi spent hours at the graves, speaking to his parents as though they could hear him. He confessed everything, the love that had blinded him, the choices that had destroyed them, and the emptiness that now consumed him. As dawn broke, he made his decision. He couldn't live with what he had done. The jungle woke with the first light of dawn. The dense canopy above filtered the sunlight into thin beams, painting the ground in patches of muted gold. Kofi stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, staring at the two unmarked graves where his parents lay buried. His legs trembled, and his chest ached with the weight of his guilt. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. In his mind, his parents' voices echoed, their words soft yet haunting. Kofi, why did you betray us? He dropped to his knees, gripping the damp earth with trembling hands. I thought I was doing it for love, he whispered, but it wasn't love. It was madness. The jungle comes alive. As the sun climbed higher, the jungle seemed to awaken. Birds called out in mournful tones, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying fragments of voices. Kofi felt as though the jungle itself was judging him, its ancient spirit watching his every move. Take me, he begged, tears streaming down his face. Take me instead. Just give them back. But the jungle remained silent, its answer clear. Kofi stood slowly, wiping the tears from his face. His body felt heavy, as if each step drained him of the little strength he had left. He placed his hands on the ground above his parents' graves, his fingers sinking into the soft earth. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice breaking. You were right about everything. About Zuri. About me. I didn't deserve your love, but you gave it to me anyway. Zuri's cruel freedom. In Mwizi City, Zuri moved on as though nothing had happened. She sold the house, pocketing the money with an air of triumph. She bought herself a new apartment in an upscale part of town, surrounding herself with luxury and indulgence. When anyone asked about Kofi, she would shrug dismissively. He's somewhere out there. He'll figure things out. But her triumph was hollow. At night, alone in her grand new apartment, she couldn't escape the memories of Kofi's face. Not the love-struck man she had manipulated, but the haunted, broken version of him that had stared at her before she cast him out. Not my problem, she muttered to herself, pouring another glass of wine. But the thought lingered. Back in the jungle, Kofi wandered aimlessly, the shadows of the trees growing longer as the day stretched on. He hadn't eaten in days, and his body was weak, but he felt no hunger, only an overwhelming emptiness. He reached a large, ancient tree whose roots curled out of the ground like skeletal fingers. Sitting beneath it, he leaned his head back against the bark, closing his eyes. The whispers of the jungle grew louder, surrounding him like a chorus. They weren't angry or vengeful, they were sorrowful, as if mourning his choices. Kofi opened his eyes and gazed at the jungle around him. Is this my punishment? He asked aloud. To live with what I've done. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He took it as an answer. As dusk fell, Kofi drifted into a fitful sleep beneath the ancient tree. In his dreams, he saw his parents. They stood in the clearing, bathed in a soft, golden light. Their faces were kind, but their eyes were filled with sadness. Kofi, Mama Adissa said, her voice gentle. We loved you. Even now, we love you. But I don't deserve it, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. Baba Mwangi stepped forward, his expression stern yet compassionate. You made a terrible choice, son, but your guilt will not bring us back. You must find peace, or the jungle will consume you. How can I find peace? Kofi asked, tears streaming down his face. I can't undo what I've done. They didn't answer. Instead, they turned and began walking away, their figures fading into the light. Kofi woke with a start, the jungle now cloaked in darkness. Kofi stood, his legs weak but his resolve firm. He returned to the graves one last time, kneeling beside them. I don't know if I can ever find peace, he said softly, but I hope, wherever you are, that you can forgive me. He placed a hand over each grave, as if trying to feel their presence one final time. Then he stood and walked toward the heart of the jungle. Kofi reached a tall cliff that overlooked the jungle. The moon shone brightly, casting its silvery light over the treetops. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the faint whispers of the jungle with it. He took a deep breath, his mind clear for the first time in weeks. He thought of his parents, of their love and sacrifice. He thought of Zuri, of the lies and manipulation that had brought him here. And he thought of himself, of the boy he had once been and the man he could never become. "I'm sorry," he whispered one last time, stepping forward. The jungle watched silently as he fell, its shadows swallowing him whole. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread through Mwizi City of a man who had disappeared into the jungle. Some said he was a ghost, a spirit cursed to wander the trees for eternity. Others claimed the jungle had claimed him as penance for his sins. Zuri, now surrounded by wealth but utterly alone, couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle's whispers had followed her. At night, when the city was quiet, she would hear faint voices calling her name. The people of Mwizi City added Kofi's story to the legends of the jungle, a cautionary tale of love, betrayal, and the unrelenting power of guilt. And deep within the jungle, the trees stood as silent witnesses, their ancient roots holding the secrets of those who had come and gone.